The room doesn't explode. There is no scream, no slammed door, no dramatic announcement delivered under spotlights. What happens instead is quieter than that. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. A rumor resurfaces, and the moment it does, everything that was supposed to be settled, identity, lineage, history, suddenly feels unstable again. Here's the uncomfortable question we almost never ask out loud. Why does the world keep returning to the same story about Prince Harry? A story that has never been proven, never confirmed, and yet somehow refuses to disappear. Because if this were really about facts, it would have ended years ago. But it didn't. And that's the first warning sign. For decades now, one idea has hovered at the edges of royal conversation. Sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted. Sometimes dressed up as new evidence, leaked documents, or more recently, DNA claims that appear online, rack up millions of views, and vanish just as quickly as they arrived. The idea that Harry is not who the world believes he is. Not biologically, not symbolically, not, in the eyes of some, legitimately. Pause there for a second. Not because the claim is true, it has never been substantiated, but because of what it reveals about us. Because the persistence of this rumor tells us something deeply unsettling about how modern audiences consume truth, how grief becomes mythology, and how one family, this family, has become a canvas for projection. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable. The rumor didn't resurface because of a verified scientific breakthrough. No certified laboratory, no court filing, no official disclosure. It resurfaced because we live in a moment where certainty is optional, where suggestion travels faster than proof, and where emotional plausibility often outweighs factual verification. So when headlines begin to circulate again, suggesting tears, DNA, final secrets, it's tempting to ask the wrong question. Is it true? The better question is this: why do we need it to be? To understand that, we have to slow down, pull back, and look not at biology, but at belief. Because the most powerful rumors are never built on evidence alone. They're built on silence, on timing, on unresolved grief, on a woman whose life ended before she could clarify her own story. Princess Diana has been gone for decades, and yet, she remains one of the most interpreted figures in modern history. Every word she wrote, every emotion she expressed, every relationship she acknowledged, or didn't, has been reanalyzed, reframed, and repurposed, sometimes with care, often without it. And when people talk about a final secret, what they're really talking about is absence. A gap where certainty should be. A space left open by tragedy. Because Diana never got the chance to grow old. Never got the chance to contextualize her younger self. Never got the chance to clarify what was private, what was fleeting, and what was never meant to be read as prophecy. That vacuum is important. Vacuum is where speculation thrives. And once speculation attaches itself to a child, especially a royal child, it doesn't let go easily. Harry grew up with cameras following him, but the story that would haunt him most didn't fully mature until later. Until after his mother was gone. Until the world started asking questions he could never answer without losing something in the process. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being born into one of the most documented families on Earth, and yet having strangers debate your identity as if it were an unsolved puzzle. Not quietly. Publicly, relentlessly. Imagine watching memes, videos, comment sections, and headlines argue over your face, your hair, your expressions, as if genetics were a parlor game. And then imagine that every few years, the story comes back, refreshed, rebranded, re-uploaded, this time with DNA in the title, this time with confirmation, this time with tears. And suddenly, what was once a fringe theory becomes something else entirely. A spectacle. But here's the contradiction that rarely gets attention. If there were real DNA evidence, verified, legitimate, incontestable, it wouldn't arrive through anonymous posts or viral thumbnails. It wouldn't be teased in dramatic language without documentation. It wouldn't surface without immediate, global, institutional consequences. Science doesn't behave like gossip, which means something else is happening here. Something quieter, something more psychological. Because the modern internet doesn't require truth to spread. It requires momentum, and momentum feeds on emotion. Think about the structure of these claims when they appear. They rarely start with data. They start with implication, with phrases like long-circulating rumors, diaries, confided privately, sources say, what they never wanted you to know. Language designed not to inform, but to pull you in. And it works. Because we are conditioned to believe that secrets, once uncovered, bring clarity. That hidden truths, once revealed, bring closure. But history tells us something different. Often, they just open new wounds. Which brings us to the part of the story that gets lost in all the speculation. This isn't just about lineage. It's about identity. And identity is not a laboratory result. Harry's public journey over the last several years. His distance from the institution, his candor about pain, his willingness to speak openly about mental health, has made him an ideal target for reinterpretation. When someone steps outside a system, people begin to rewrite their origin story. Was he always different? Was he never fully part of it? Was there something off? These questions don't come from evidence. They come from narrative convenience. Because it's easier to explain conflict by changing the backstory than by confronting the system itself. And once that narrative takes hold, it doesn't need to be proven. It just needs to be repeated. Now add one more ingredient. Silence. The royal family does not litigate rumors in public. They rarely correct speculation unless it crosses a specific threshold. This approach, historically, has preserved dignity. But in the digital age, it has had an unintended side effect. Silence gets interpreted as avoidance. Restraint gets mistaken for concealment. And suddenly, the absence of a statement becomes evidence for those who are already inclined to believe. So when no one rushes out to debunk a viral claim, especially one framed as science, it doesn't calm the waters. It agitates them. And somewhere in the middle of that noise is a real human being. Not a symbol, not a theory. A person who lost his mother violently, publicly, and far too young. A person whose grief has been consumed as content since he was a child. A person who has had to watch the world argue over who he is, instead of listening to who he says he is. That's the part that rarely makes it into the headlines. Because it's not clickable. It doesn't resolve neatly. It asks us to sit with discomfort. And that's not what viral culture rewards. So instead, we get cycles. Every few years, the same story returns with new packaging, new visuals, new insiders, new technological language layered on top of old speculation. This time it's DNA. Last time, it was diaries. Before that, it was timing. Before that, resemblance. And each version claims to be the one that finally settles it. But none of them do. Because the truth, whatever it may be, is not actually the point anymore. The rumor has outgrown its origin. It has become a mirror. A mirror reflecting our obsession with hidden narratives, our distrust of institutions, and our hunger for revelations that promise to explain everything. And here's the most unsettling part of all. Even if definitive proof existed, one way or the other, would it actually bring peace? Or would it simply become the next chapter in a story that thrives on instability? Because if there's one thing this saga has shown us, it's this. Certainty doesn't always end speculation. Sometimes it intensifies it. So before we go any further, we need to be clear about what this investigation is and what it isn't. This is not about declaring a hidden truth. It's about examining why the claim persists, why it resurfaces when it does, who benefits when it spreads, and what it costs the people at the center of it. Because the real damage here isn't hypothetical. It's lived. And as we move forward, peeling back the layers, media, history, psychology, silence, you'll start to see something emerge. Not a scandal, a pattern. And once you see that pattern, the story stops being about DNA entirely. It becomes about something far more unsettling. How easily we mistake repetition for truth. How quickly we turn grief into entertainment. And how one unresolved loss can echo for generations. But the origins of this rumor didn't begin online. They began much earlier, in a different media landscape, with a different set of incentives. And a moment that, at the time, seemed almost insignificant, until it wasn't. Because what happened next didn't just shape the rumor. It ensured it would never fully disappear. And that's where we have to go next. IT started with something that barely registered as scandal at the time. A sentence, a photograph, a tone, nothing explosive. Nothing definitive, just enough to make editors pause and readers lean in. Here's the question worth asking before anything else. How does a rumor survive for decades without ever being proven? Because the story about Harry's paternity didn't erupt out of nowhere. It didn't begin online. It didn't originate in a comment section or a viral clip. It began in a much older ecosystem, one that understood something we sometimes forget now. You don't need proof to start a narrative. You only need plausibility. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the British tabloid press was operating at full throttle. Competition was brutal. Deadlines were unforgiving. And the royal family, especially a young, unhappy princess, was the most valuable currency available. Every gesture was dissected, every smile compared, every silence interpreted. And then came the idea. Not a claim, not an accusation, an implication. Harry, from the moment he was old enough to be photographed standing next to his father and brother, was described as different. That word appeared again and again in early coverage, sometimes affectionately, sometimes curiously, sometimes with a faint edge that's hard to define but easy to feel. Different hair, different temperament, different energy. It sounds harmless when you say it like that, almost flattering. Children are different. Siblings don't always resemble each other. Families don't come in uniform packages. But the press didn't leave it there. They never do. Instead, difference became distance. Distance became speculation. And speculation became an open-ended question no one quite dared to ask directly, at least not at first. Why doesn't he look like them? Pause on that. Because that question says more about the observer than the subject. Royal families, more than most, are expected to perform continuity. Faces become symbols. Bloodlines become brands. And when something appears to deviate, even slightly, it disrupts the illusion. The press sensed that disruption. And then, a name entered the conversation. Not in headlines, not in accusations, in whispers. A man the public already knew. A man already linked to Diana in another context. A man whose presence offered an alternative narrative that felt, to some, emotionally coherent. The timing mattered. This part often gets glossed over. The relationship that tabloids would later obsess over did not align with Harry's birth timeline. That fact has been stated repeatedly, quietly, almost defensively, by those close to the family. But rumors don't thrive on timelines. They thrive on association. Once two names exist in the same story, chronology becomes optional. What mattered wasn't when things happened. What mattered was that they could be connected. And once that connection was made, it never fully dissolved. Editors knew better than to print outright allegations. The legal risks were too high. The palace would respond. Lawsuits would follow. Careers could end. So instead, they did something far more effective. They planted questions. They published side-by-side photos. They used language like remarkable resemblance and uncanny similarities. They let readers do the rest. And readers did. Because once an idea enters the public imagination, it begins to evolve independently of its source. People bring their own assumptions, their own frustrations, their own emotional logic. And Diana, by that point, had become a deeply sympathetic figure. Unhappy marriage, constant scrutiny, loneliness made public. When people feel compassion, they also feel protective. And when protection mixes with suspicion, narratives shift quickly. Suddenly, the rumor wasn't just salacious. It was framed as understanding, as empathy, as an attempt to see the real story. And here's where things get more complicated. Because Diana herself, in various interviews and recordings, spoke openly about feeling trapped, about feeling misunderstood, about being monitored and managed. Those admissions were brave. They were raw. They were also dangerous in a media environment hungry for subtext. Every word she spoke, especially later, was treated not just as testimony, but as code. People began reading between lines that weren't there, or perhaps were never meant to be read at all. So when she acknowledged relationships outside her marriage, relationships that occurred after Harry was born, that distinction didn't slow the rumor. It accelerated it. Why? Because the narrative people wanted wasn't factual. It was symbolic. The idea of Harry being different became shorthand for something larger. A child born into a system already breaking. A living reminder of a marriage that failed in public view. That symbolism was far more compelling than any birth certificate. And then came the silence. No formal denials. No press conferences. No official explanations addressing the rumor head-on. Just nothing. At the time, that approach was standard. Royal silence had long been interpreted as strength, dignity, distance from the noise. But silence has a way of mutating over time, especially when it leaves space. And into that space stepped commentators, biographers, anonymous sources, people with partial information and complete confidence. Each iteration slightly altered the story. One would emphasize emotional distance between parents. Another would focus on supposed physical traits. Another would invoke Diana's emotional vulnerability. None of it added up to evidence. But it didn't have to, because the rumor wasn't being passed around as fact. It was being passed around as possibility. And possibility is sticky. As Harry grew older, the dynamic shifted again. The child at the center of speculation became a teenager, then a young man, then a soldier, then a husband, then a father. Each new phase of his life offered fresh material for reinterpretation. His defiance became genetic. His independence became inherited. His discomfort within the institution became proof, at least in the minds of some, that he had never truly belonged. Do you see how this works? Behavior gets retrofitted into biology. Psychology gets mistaken for heredity. And suddenly, a rumor that began as visual curiosity transforms into an explanation for everything. It becomes convenient. And convenient stories travel far. By the time the internet matured into what it is now, the rumor was already fully formed. It didn't need to be invented. It just needed to be revived. And each revival followed the same pattern. A headline would hint at something new. An article would reference long-standing speculation. A video would claim to connect the dots. None of them offered proof. All of them offered narrative satisfaction. But here's the part that rarely gets acknowledged. Every time the rumor resurfaced, it required a kind of emotional cost from the person at its center. Imagine living your life knowing that no matter what you accomplish, no matter how publicly your parents acknowledge you, a portion of the world will always treat your identity as provisional, conditional, debatable. That kind of scrutiny doesn't just fade into background noise. It shapes how you see yourself, how you trust institutions, how you relate to history, and perhaps most importantly, how you respond when the story comes back again. Because by the time DNA entered the modern versions of this narrative, the groundwork had already been laid decades earlier. DNA wasn't the beginning. It was the escalation, a scientific word attached to an emotional myth. And science carries authority, even when it's misused, especially when it's misused. So when recent claims started circulating, suggesting tests, confirmations, secrets finally revealed, they didn't feel new to people who had followed this story for years. They felt inevitable, like the next logical chapter in a story that had been waiting for a climax. But inevitability doesn't equal truth. It equals momentum. And momentum is dangerous when it outruns verification. Because once a rumor adopts the language of certainty, it changes how it's consumed. It stops being speculative entertainment and starts behaving like revelation. That's when the stakes shift. That's when real harm enters the equation. And that's when we have to stop and ask something more difficult than, is it true? We have to ask how we got here. Why this story, in particular, has endured when so many others have collapsed under scrutiny. Why this child, out of all royal children, became the vessel for unresolved questions about love, legitimacy, and betrayal. And why the public keeps returning to Diana, not as she was, but as they need her to be. Because the rumor didn't survive on evidence. It survived on emotional coherence. And emotional coherence can be more persuasive than facts. But it also obscures something critical. The more we focus on the rumor, the less we examine the machinery that keeps it alive. The editors, the incentives, the business model of outrage and intrigue, the way ambiguity is monetized. And once you start pulling on that thread, the story shifts again. It stops being about one family. It becomes about an entire industry built on unanswered questions. An industry that thrives when silence meets speculation. And that brings us to the next layer of this story. Because if the rumor began with implication and survived through silence, its next transformation happened through something far more intimate. Private words, written down, never intended for us, and read, later, as if they were clues. What people believe Diana's diaries say, and what they actually contain, are not the same thing. And that difference matters more than almost anyone admits. Because once private pain becomes public text, interpretation replaces intention. And that's where this story takes its most consequential turn. People like to say diaries don't lie. It's a comforting idea. Ink on paper. Private thoughts. No audience. No agenda. But that belief collapses the moment diaries are removed from their original context and handed to the public. Because diaries don't speak for themselves. They're spoken for, interpreted, edited, filtered through whoever happens to be holding them at the time. And in this story, the diaries became